Hello, I'm Nate, aka B2 Mutineer. I usually make videos about games I enjoy, in particular RPGs. If you've been around a while, you'll know that Dragon Age Origins is my all-time favorite game, and I love the Dragon Age series for its storytelling, fascinating fantasy world building, and diverse, morally complex characters. You may also know that I'm trans, queer, and neurodivergent since I've mentioned it in my initial video about Veilguard. I think that most reasonable people are probably tired of hearing about the way minority communities are represented in Veilguard by now. I feel like I've aged at least 5 years hearing all the discourse, but unfortunately, as a trans person, I can't ignore what is being said. This game has emboldened the culture war that was already going on, and everyone, no matter their side, is for some reason ignoring some extremely obvious details about the poor quality of Veilguard's trans representation. So here is my analysis and critique of the so-called woke representation of trans people in Dragon Age to Veilguard. I am aware of the fact that making this video is likely going to get me hate from both sides, but I don't care. If I can get even just a handful of people to understand that representing minorities in media is far more complex than just including them there to check a box, this video will have been worth it. I would also like to mention that I am not American or Canadian, despite what my accent may sound like. I live in Romania, a country considered part of Eastern Europe or the Balkans, and things aren't great here either in terms of trans, queer, and neurodivergent rights and access to services. You need to understand, culture doesn't revolve around American politics, so even if I'm speaking in English to you with a fairly American-style accent, that doesn't mean I am involved in whatever's happening in the United States. And my voice can carry just as much weight as other people's voices in discussions about the representation of aspects of my identity in media. Without further ado, let's get into it. Game spoilers will obviously be discussed. My critique begins at the very beginning of the game, where in the character creator you have the option to choose whether your character has top surgery scars or not. First of all, why would transgender characters in Thedas be able to have top surgery when the technology and medicine in this world are not nearly advanced enough for such medical procedures? Or if such surgeries did exist, the scars would certainly not look so clean. Secondly, why would a real-life trans person want for their character to have surgery scars in a fantasy world where magic exists, and something like flesh-shaping blood magic is a possibility? Thirdly, why would a real-life transmasculine person want to have top surgery scars at all? I'm a trans guy, and I personally haven't had top surgery because my chest is appropriate enough in my opinion that I don't feel the need for it. But if I had chosen to have top surgery, it would only be because my appearance didn't match how I felt inside, and it made me feel dysphoric. I would likely still feel some dysphoria whenever I saw the surgery scars because they would remind me of the fact that I was not born in the type of body I felt like, and I had to change it in order to get to a point where it felt appropriate. So no, if I lived in a fantasy world like Thedas, I would not want to undergo surgery that would leave me with extremely obvious scars that would imply to others what my body used to look like before. Still, let's say that somehow in northern Thedas like Antiva, Tevinter, Nevarra, or Ravane, medicine is advanced enough for top surgery to exist. And let's say that your character is maybe scared of magic and prefers to transition through medical means instead. Even in this case, I don't understand why the top surgery scars are a completely separate option in the character creator instead of just being included in the scars section. You could have absolutely made it possible for people to choose multiple scars to have active on their character and have both the cool battle scars or whatever you headcanon happened as part of your character's backstory, as well as top surgery scars if that's what you want your character to look like. It would be far more inclusive. Making the top surgery scars separate seems like it was done specifically to bring a lot of attention onto them. And I really have to say, that's the worst way to go about things if your ultimate goal is to have more people feel like they are represented in media, as well as to bring awareness to trans identities so that people are more understanding and accepting of them. By putting this option front and center, you are just giving more ammunition to the types of people who say that queer and trans people shouldn't be involved in the creation of media because they'll make it all about them and force it down everyone's throats. I'm sorry to say that if you do just that, you are not going to get a positive response from most people, even from trans people like me who do like to see themselves represented in more media, who do like to have the option for their character to be trans in a video game. But not like this. Not in a way that gets more negative attention pointed at us and gets people to be less likely to understand and accept us. Let's move on to the choices you have when you interact with Varric's shaving mirror that he gifted to Rook. Here are all the choices you get to pick about your gender identity if you decide that you want your character to be a trans man. Keep in mind that these are paraphrasing what your character will say. I'm getting there, I love who I am, feels good to see the real me. Here's the thing, these options as they are presented would have been perfectly fine if what Rook said was genuinely just a slight development on these short sentences. However, if you pick any of these things, your character ends up saying something extremely cringy and often completely different from what you expected them to say. If you choose I love who I am, Rook says, there he is, the man I knew I was. I did the work, I stuck with it, and now I get to see him every time I look at the mirror. Ugh. Who in their right mind would say something like that to themselves, no less? It's the most cringy thing I've ever heard in my life, and it genuinely pained me to have to read these words out loud. What do you mean, I did the work, I stuck with it? What work? You don't work on transitioning, or at least it shouldn't feel like work. You just need hormone treatment and possibly some other assistance such as surgery or perhaps voice therapy in order to transition to a point where you feel comfortable. The transition process is different for every trans person, as each person has a different goal for how they want to look and sound and act like, so that they can feel comfortable in their own skin and so that they can be perceived in the way that they want to be perceived in society. But if there's one thing that's certain, transitioning shouldn't feel like work. It is an extremely liberating and joyful thing as you begin to feel more like your exterior matches your interior. You don't stick with it. You simply do it because that's the only thing that feels right to do. I'm sorry to say that if you feel like transitioning is work or that you have to stick with it, maybe you aren't as certain of your identity as you'd like to think you are. Maybe you need some therapy first to get over the trauma you very clearly have. The weirdest thing is that once again, the short version of this option, I love who I am, is a perfectly normal thing to say and feel. It's very nice to be able to love who you are after you had to struggle with the way you felt in your own body and with how other people perceived and treated you. But the long version of this option? Horrible. And before I move on to the other options, let me also just mention another thing that people part of Veilguard's development clearly have no idea about. Just because you're trans, it does not mean that you have to go through a transition process. You don't have to undergo hormone therapy. You don't have to get any surgeries done. You don't have to act more masculine or act more feminine or look androgynous to be a real trans or non-binary person. You can be yourself, however that feels comfortable for you. There are men who like to wear more so-called feminine clothing, and women who, for example, don't like to wear skirts or dresses for reasons that have nothing to do with gender identity. You can find pants too restrictive and thus prefer to wear skirts. You can find skirts uncomfortable, maybe your legs rub against each other. Or maybe you just don't like how you look like in skirts or dresses or pants or button-ups or jackets or whatever other article of clothing. How you dress has no real bearing on how you feel inside. How you dress is an aesthetic choice you make that has more to do with your aesthetic style than gender. And yes, sure, clothing choices and gender identity are often correlated in our society, but it's extremely offensive to reduce trans identities to this person doesn't like wearing skirts, so that must mean they want to be a man, or this person wants to wear dresses, so that must mean they want to be a woman. I will come back to this when we discuss Taash and their non-binary identity. If you choose I'm getting there when you look in the mirror, I was personally expecting my character to talk about how they're still going through the transition process and haven't yet reached a point where they're 100% comfortable with their body and appearance, but that it's been getting better. Instead, Rook says, I don't know, Varric. Catching my reflection still hits hard some days, but knowing who I am is worth it. And every day when I look in that mirror, I'm closer to seeing the man I want to be staring back. Now look, this option is slightly better than the first one, but it's still extremely dramatic and cringy. And even worse than that, it kind of implies that knowing who you are is some magical part of being trans that makes everything better. Like, no. I have known who I am since I was 4 years old, and knowing who I was from such an early age only made me feel worse about life because I had to endure people misgendering me and treating me like a girl for far too many years until I became an adult and was finally able to make my own choices and transition. Knowing who you are is a basic part of being human. If you don't know who you are, then I think you have some mental issues. Everyone knows who they are, or else if they don't, it simply means they're still a child and haven't had enough experiences to discover their various perspectives and preferences that make up their personality and identity. I understand that some trans people realize that they are trans later in life than I did, but I still think it's harmful to say knowing who I am is worth it, because at first, knowing who you are only brings you misery and dysphoria because who you are inside doesn't match the outside. I have no idea who wrote this crap, but they clearly do not understand what it's like to be trans or else have some serious trauma and honestly internalized transphobia to write a trans character in this way. I'm closer to seeing the man I want to be. I am a man. I don't want to be one. Like sure, a little kid wouldn't have the words to express themselves properly and would say things like, I think I was born in the wrong body, I should have been born a boy, or I want to be a boy. I said those things when I was 4 because I didn't have any better words in my vocabulary and I didn't even know that other trans people existed. Rook, however, is implied to be a full-ass adult who should know much better than to perpetuate these kinds of phrases which suggest that trans people are only playing at being the other gender. This is a harmful way to represent trans people because it allows those who are anti-trans to use these things against us by saying, well, it's just dress up, they only want to be like this other gender but aren't really. Ugh. Anyway, on to the third option. Feels good to see the real me. I chose this option during my Veilguard stream, and it made me have such a visceral reaction because that's not what I wanted my character to say. I thought my rook would say that their transition took a long time, but that they're now really happy with where they are and it feels so good to see themselves in the mirror. I chose this option because I thought it would describe my experience as someone who had to wait quite a long time to be able to transition, and then it also took a few years until I got to a point where I truly felt comfortable in my body. But no, what Rook actually says is, "It took a while for me to figure out why the face staring back from the mirror felt wrong, but once I was able to be honest with myself, it was a relief to figure out I was trans, and it's worth it to look in the mirror today and see the man I am staring back." Ugh, blech. Oh god, I'm so sorry. This is just so bad. Here's the thing, I can't speak for the experiences of trans people who realize that they're trans later in life, so perhaps for them it really was a relief to figure out that they're trans after they felt uncomfortable in their bodies for a long time but couldn't figure out why. The reason this choice bothers me isn't because of that. It bothers me because the paraphrased option that you choose does not imply whatsoever that you are about to say that your character realized they were trans later in life. I did not want to choose this option for my character. If I want to create a trans character in a video game, if I have such an option to comment on how they feel about their trans identity, I want my experience to be included too. I don't want my character to not have known they were trans for a long time. I knew since I was a little kid. Let my character have that option too. If you're including the option to say Rook realized their gender identity later in life, then you have to have an option for people who basically always knew as well. It's not fair to only represent one particular person's trans experience and pass it off as the only experience your character can have. I don't want my character to say it took them a long time to figure out they were trans. I don't want my character to say that transitioning was work that they had to stick with. And I don't want my character to say the man they want to be is closer to staring back in the mirror. And at the very least, if these are the only options you are going to include, then paraphrase them more accurately so that I can understand what they actually say. Because then I would simply decide that I don't want my character to be trans if this is the way you represent trans people in your game. So no, I don't think the representation of trans people is done well in the choices Rook is given to discuss their trans identity. These choices highlight only a small subset of trans people, and if your experience as a trans person doesn't match this very particular personal fantasy of the creators, then tough luck. Your identity doesn't matter to them. These choices also perpetuate harmful ideas such as trans people only wanting to dress up as the other gender, and are on the whole written in an overdramatic way that has the opposite effect. Instead of making you feel more connected to the experience of a trans character, you are put off by the dramatics and see it as cringy instead. And finally, let us move on to the main attraction of this horror show, which I'm sure people have been the most horrified by: the character of Taash and the portrayal of their realization that they are non-binary. There are 3 scenes I'm going to analyze: Taash and Neve talking about gender dysphoria, Taash coming out as non-binary to their mother, and the infamous Isabella Bharv scene. First, Taash and Neve discussing gender.
Why do you run around in fancy mage clothes?
Because I like them?
You're barely even wearing a shirt.
You fight Anton with a bare midriff.
Everything all right?
We're fine. Just trading fashion tips. So what I wear is a problem for you?
It's not. It's just... why dress like that? Are you trying to make your mother happy?
Let's take a look at the beginning of this scene. Taash, for some reason, is saying that Neve is dressed in a way that is unnatural or too feminine, and implies that Neve may be dressing in such a manner just because she wants to make her own mother happy. I'm sorry, but this is quite possibly the worst introduction to someone talking about gender dysphoria that I've ever seen. First of all, Neve doesn't even wear particularly feminine clothing. She wears pants, she has a button-up shirt that, sure, shows off a lot of her chest, but her chest is flat, and really, her clothing doesn't scream femininity at me. Neve's clothing is stylish, but honestly more in the way that I would expect a gay man to dress rather than a woman. She just doesn't look all that feminine. In fact, it would be extremely hard to make Taash have this conversation with any of the female characters in the party, because no one wears dresses or skirts. No one looks particularly feminine. Balara wears extremely practical clothes as a tinkerer and adventurer. Harding is also the same as a scout. Neve is a detective who has to walk the streets of Minrathous, so while she has more style than Balara and Harding, she's still dressed in a fairly practical manner other than the exposed flat chest situation. It felt like the writers wanted to force Taash to speak this way to a woman just so they could imply that Taash doesn't feel comfortable with femininity. But unfortunately, no female character in this game is even feminine enough for that to be possible. Hell, Taash's own mother wears clothes that look more like the robes of a mage or a priest, not a feminine dress whatsoever, since it makes the woman look basically like a potato sack. No feminine curves allowed, lest God forbid anyone get horny over some pixels. I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, but Taash's way of speaking is extremely infantile and honestly quite offensive towards everyone they speak to. But for some reason, everyone else just accepts the way Taash insults them or yells at them just because? I really don't understand it. Don't understand why you aren't given options to disagree with your companions, even if they are necessary to the main plot for their special skills. I don't know whether someone on the team at Bioware thought that it would send the wrong message to let the player disapprove of various things the companions say, but this decision to not let the player have a different opinion has greatly backfired. Now people are describing Veilguard as propaganda because you aren't allowed any option but to agree with what the writers want you to agree with. And honestly, I can't disagree with people calling this propaganda because that's exactly what propaganda does. It presents itself as the only correct option, convincing you to agree and believe the things it presents to you as the right way to think. Look, as a trans and queer guy, I absolutely want people like me to be more accepted. I want us to be considered a regular part of society and be allowed to live our lives in peace. But this is not the way to get there. This has the opposite effect. This makes people hate us more. Anyway, back to Taash. For some reason, we're talking about feminine clothing and how Taash has trauma of their mother telling them to wear dresses. And that equates not only to them being trans, but also attacking other people's fashion choices, such as Neve's. I'm sorry that I even have to make this statement at all, but being trans or queer or any other minority does not give you the right to be an asshole. Taash implying that Neve's way of dressing is wrong or unnatural is simply an asshole thing to say, invalidating Neve's own identity as a woman and the way she chooses to express herself as such. Let us continue through this disaster of a scene.
Taash, what's going on? Something is clearly bothering you.
My bet's on mothers and dresses.
It's just something my mother said the other day. That I act more like a man than a woman.
And you feel like you should wear dresses to make her happy?
No. Can you imagine me in a dress? I'd look stupider than I'd look stupid.
This isn't about the dress, is it?
No, it's... I don't know. She always says stuff like that. About how I dress, how I act.
And?
It feels... right. When she says I act more like a man. It feels... right. Why does it feel right?
I have no idea why Taash feels the need to say that they would look stupider than they are, than they already look like. I don't know what they were implying there. Then they just settle on stating that they would look stupid in a dress. Thinking that you look bad in a certain article of clothing has nothing to do with being trans, by the way. You can absolutely have preferences about how your body looks like in various types of clothes, and that's just part of your fashion style. As a trans man, I never thought I looked stupid in a dress. I simply felt extremely uncomfortable in one because people saw me as a girl or woman, which I did not feel like. And additionally, I also found dresses uncomfortable due to my legs rubbing against each other. Even if I wasn't a trans guy, I would have likely simply never enjoyed wearing skirts or dresses due to that uncomfortable feeling of bare legs or too thin tights. And then we get to the point at which I become even more confused about Taash's entire thing with being non-binary. Taash says that when their mother says Taash acts more like a man, it feels right. So then, pray tell, why isn't Taash a trans man if they feel like acting like a man is something that feels right? Oh right. Other than Rook, who gets a few cringy lines, and Tarquin, who just appears a little bit, though I do appreciate the character being voiced by a trans man, we can't really discuss trans-masculine identities much. And if someone even thinks to say to me, well, you already had Krem in Inquisition, why did you want a transgender male character to be more important in the story? Are you hearing yourself? Krem had such a small role and could essentially be ignored. In contrast, Taash is non-binary, and if you want to get the good ending of the game, you are forced to be part of this entire journey of them discovering their non-binary, and not only that, but you're also forced to agree with them and be extremely supportive. Compared to this, you could completely ignore Krem, and when you spoke to him about being trans, your Inquisitor didn't even have the option to be supportive. You could either be confused or outright not understand or agree with his experience. And while I absolutely think you should also have had an option to be understanding or supportive, I do appreciate that you had other options in Inquisition to be more of an asshole as well, because if you were role-playing an evil Inquisitor, they could kill and torture and imprison people, but suddenly they would draw the line at transphobia. Anyway, just wanted to mention how there is a clear bias towards trans-feminine and non-binary identities being represented, whereas trans men are just represented in a much smaller, far less meaningful way. And as a trans man, I have to say that it kind of sucks. However, I honestly am relieved that Bioware's writers didn't focus more strongly on representing trans men, because if Taash is any indication, it would be a horrible experience seeing myself represented in such a way. Anyway, hate to break it to you, whoever needs to hear this, but being non-binary isn't about feeling more like a man than a woman, or being more like a woman than a man. That's being a trans man or a trans woman. Being non-binary isn't about not liking wearing dresses or not liking wearing pants. Being non-binary means you don't really feel like your gender identity fits with either men or women. However, that does not mean you have to dress in an androgynous way either. There are non-binary people who prefer to look more masculine, others who prefer to look more feminine, and of course some as well who do prefer a more androgynous or as genderless look as possible. However, in our society, this genderless androgynous look is really a fairly masculine presentation, even if people like to pretend that it isn't, that it's some third mysterious thing. As much as people would like to pretend otherwise, masculine tends to be the default, even if this is pushed forward as neutral. Anyway, not here to discuss gender expression and performativity through clothing, but do keep that in mind. In essence, please remember that gender isn't mainly about the clothes you wear. It's about how you feel and how you want to be perceived and treated in society. And yes, clothes do play a part in that, but they're not the main thing. Continuing with the scene.
Taash, do you like being a woman?
Nobody likes being a woman.
Ah.
This is stupid. Forget I said anything.
Hey, it's not stupid. I do like being a woman, but if you don't, maybe that's something to think about.
But what does it mean?
It could be about your mother's expectations, or about how it feels to be a woman and Kunari. Or maybe it's being a woman, period.
How would knowing that help? It won't change anything.
First off, it's absolutely offensive and invalidating to a lot of other people's experience to say that nobody likes being a woman. Plenty of women love being women, including trans women. Obviously, if they didn't enjoy being women, why would they even transition in the first place? This statement screams of self-hatred and internalized misogyny. It's one thing to say that you personally don't enjoy being a woman, and it's another thing entirely to imply that everyone who is a woman must secretly hate it. In this scene, a woman rook can interject to say that she does like being a woman, but that's honestly too little too late. Neve's only reaction is to say, ah. I don't even know what that means. I have no idea what Neve is implying when she says, ah, in response to Taash saying that nobody likes being a woman. Does Neve not like being a woman either? Does that ah imply she agrees? We don't really know because Neve herself doesn't actually comment on this, and only a woman rook has the option to say this if the player chooses it. Otherwise, if you choose the other options, I guess you just let this comment from Taash pass, as if it's fine to just say things like this about other people's gender and how they feel about it. But then it gets really weird because Taash asks, but what does it mean in relation to how they feel about being a woman? Then when Rook offers an explanation, all Taash has to say about it is, how would knowing that help? It won't change anything. I'm sorry, what? Taash was the one who asked what it means in the first place, but then suddenly after Rook offers a few possibilities, they don't want to think about it anymore because it won't change anything. But then previously, when you could choose to officially have your Rook be trans, knowing who you are is super important. Which one is it, Bioware? Does it not mean anything, or is it crucial? And then let's get the last part of this scene out of the way too.
Some of my friends in Minrathous talk about not feeling comfortable in their own skin. As a man, as a woman. I could see if they'd like to talk. Maybe what they say fits how you're feeling.
Yeah. Okay. And thanks. You do look really pretty.
Oh?
To look at, I'd smudge your makeup.
Thanks for letting me down gently.
First of all, yuck. I'm sorry, I think that is the most explicitly sexual thing I've heard in a Dragon Age game. Not even Isabella was so uncouth, and she was one of my favorite characters. So you tell someone you look really pretty, and they say oh, perhaps expecting something of a romantic nature, and then you suddenly turn it sexual by implying you would smudge their makeup with actions that I would prefer not to talk about as someone who is on the asexual spectrum, thank you. What Neve says is very nice and thoughtful, offering to talk to some trans people who could meet up with Taash to discuss their own experiences so that Taash can figure out how they feel and see if any of those other trans people's experiences sound similar to how Taash is feeling. Then Taash responds with, yeah, okay. First of all, that's such a modern way of talking that takes me right out of the setting. But really, implying something sexual towards a person that you don't like is a way to let them down gently. I know that I'm autistic and on the ace spectrum, but that doesn't sound like the appropriate way to reject someone's romantic or sexual advances. In fact, Taash's line sounds far more like they are encouraging more flirtation, not putting a stop to it. While I was watching the scene to write down my thoughts on it, my partner said it sounds like the writers played the game Exquisite Corpse, where each person writes one line on a piece of paper, then gives the paper to the next person who writes a line, and then conceals everything but the last line written, before giving the paper to the next person, who also writes a line only having seen the previous one, and so on, which usually ends with a quite nonsensical or surreal story due to the players only having seen the latest sentence before adding their contribution. Honestly, after my partner described it like this, I can't see this scene in any other way. It does genuinely feel like multiple people wrote different parts of it and then Frankensteined it together to create this abomination of a scene that makes no fucking sense. I hope that my notes on this scene have shed some light on why such representation is not as progressive or positive as it may seem. I have to agree with the sentiment that the trans representation in this game isn't truly meant to make trans people feel seen or make them more accepted in society. Instead, it feels just like one particular trans person's personal fantasy, making all the characters say what they want as if they're acting out a scene with puppets, rather than try to represent complex and imperfect characters talking about a difficult subject. I'm not here to point a finger at Corinne Bush or perhaps at Trick Weeks. However, I can't help but look towards them for the direction of these scenes, as the two of them are trans people who worked on this game in a leadership position, Corinne as the game director and Trick as the lead writer. No matter how bad this representation is, however, please do not send hate towards any creator involved in Veilguard's development. It's one thing to analyze and criticize a piece of media and discuss our criticism in hopes that the creators will learn from their mistakes moving forward. It's another thing entirely to accuse them and throw hate at them for what is ultimately a human mistake. A human mistake as part of a franchise worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but still a human mistake. And you can't blame only a handful of people for what was, after all, approved at a corporate level by dozens of people higher in the corporate chain. Let us move on to analyzing the scene where Taash comes out to their mother, Shathann, as non-binary. This scene was so confusing to me as a trans person because Taash's mother actually sounds accepting of their child's identity, even if a bit confused at first. But there is no negative reaction there, simply confusion and a desire to understand. I wish people could react in such a curious and positive way in general when people come out to them as trans.
This is where we eat.
I see.
Shathann, it's good to see you again.
My child wished to show me where she now lived.
I made food. Here, this cup. Made it myself.
And do you have powdered ginger for the table?
I'll go get some.
You are not good enough for my child.
I haven't heard any complaints.
You are emotionally sloppy and lack the resolve she needs. You will only bring her pain.
Or I could make Taash happy.
It is not about happiness.
Then what is it about?
Teaching my child to survive in this world.
Taash is an adult. If you haven't finished teaching by now...
I have failed, yes. I was never taught how to be a mother. Under the Qun, children are raised by those suited to such pursuits. I trained as a scholar. I was taught to think critically, to analyze without passion, and correct mistakes. You need not tell me that I am an inadequate mother. I am aware.
Then why did you leave?
When I see my child in danger, I act.
Here's the ginger.
Thank you.
So, I'm non-binary.
What does that mean?
It means I don't feel like a man or a woman.
If you are neither a man nor a woman, then what are you?
Non-binary. I just said, and I'm going to use they instead of she from now on.
If this is because I have criticized your dress or your manners...
It isn't!
Under the Qun, the term for one whose gender does not match the one given to them at birth was a Qunathlok. Perhaps you are like that.
Why do you have to keep picking at it? Why can't you just be happy for me?
Evatash, Chakra to Ebra.
So I'm supposed to struggle with who I am? Even if I don't feel like I fit, even if I feel wrong?
No, you misunderstood.
Then say it better! Why am I never enough for you?
I will go. Thank you for inviting me to your home. Panahedan.
The options you're given as Rook are only to be supportive of Taash and not in any way to try to explain that Shathann was actually right in what she was saying, not to mention that she was in fact accepting and trying to understand her child. If until now you weren't convinced that the trans representation in Veilguard is someone's self-insert personal fantasy, or some strange attempt at working through their own trauma, here is a perfect scene encapsulating this problem. Shathann is a logical and well-meaning person who is somehow written extremely well despite the rest of the dialogue, actually fitting the style that I associate with Dragon Age. I get whiplash whenever Taash speaks because Shathann talks absolutely normally and in a way that actually fits Thedas, and then Taash is a slap to the face. Did two completely different writers write Shathann and Taash's lines? I swear this scene feels even more like that Exquisite Corpse game, but instead it's just one person writing one character and another person writing the other character without ever knowing what that other character said in response. Shathann explains her own shortcomings as a mother, talking about how in the Qun there are people trained as caretakers who raise children, and she herself was trained to be a scholar instead, so did not have so much knowledge and skills to be a good caretaker. She knows she fails as a parent, but tries to make up for it regardless. Not only is Shathann accepting, but she is also genuinely trying to understand Taash and make them feel more like they belong. Their mother literally explains the word for transgender individuals, which includes non-binary identities, that is lore-friendly and comes from the Qunari society. Akun Athlok, meaning someone whose gender does not match the one assigned to them at birth. And then Taash gets upset that Shathann understands exactly what they're talking about. Shathann isn't picking at it, she is simply trying to offer her child reassurance that this identity they're talking about does exist and they're not alone in it. But Taash goes absolutely ballistic, yelling at their mother and asking, "Why am I never enough for you?" When literally the mother does not imply such a thing, and even more so implies that she herself has not been enough for Taash as a mother. Shokra to Ebra means through struggle you find what you are. Shathann is trying to say within her own words that struggling is a natural part of life that allows you to understand who you are better. It makes perfect sense, and yet Taash gets angry and assumes their mother means to tell them to continue suffering or something. I'm sorry, if Taash was a teenager, this conversation would make sense, as teenagers are often prone to exaggerating and also have that rebellious thing of needing to disagree with everything their parents say. But as an adult, and especially as a character who is supposed to be reliable enough for you to recruit as part of fighting against the blighted Evanuris, it makes no sense for Taash to be this emotionally immature or unintelligent. I am completely baffled at how this scene is framed, making the player be extremely uncharitable towards Shathann, despite her remarks being nothing but reasonable and well-meaning. Ask actual trans people who have had negative experiences with coming out, and they will tell you they wish their own parents or other people in their lives reacted like this. I certainly do. Finally, let's talk about the infamous Bharv scene. I'm so sorry, Isabella, they butchered your character entirely. I don't want to get into Isabella's outfit and deflated breasts or the way she as a character would never put herself in the center of attention for making a mistake. Let's just not open that can of worms. Let's just focus on the misgendering, apology, and then completely unnecessary push-ups. In this scene, Isabella tells a story from Taash's past and accidentally uses the pronoun she instead of they. This is fine. It happens sometimes, especially when you've just recently found out that someone is trans and you adjust to using the new pronouns. Balara gets a bit awkward, then Isabella realizes her own mistake and says, "Ah shit, they're still holding it. Sorry." That should have been the end of it. Isabella corrects herself, apologizes, and moves on. That is the correct way to act if you accidentally misgender someone. Apologize, correct yourself, move on. What Isabella does in this scene is the most confusing, self-flagellating, narcissistic thing I've ever seen, and I have no idea why anyone in their right mind would write a scene like this unless they were actually trying to make fun of trans people. Instead of stopping there, Isabella goes on to walk over to a stage where there is enough space and starts to do push-ups. Taash is eerily silent, even though they are the person who has been misgendered. Instead of Taash discussing the situation with Isabella, if for some reason you needed there to be a longer discussion, Balara asks Isabella why she's doing push-ups. Isabella explains some bullshit story about a fellow Lord of Fortune, Bharv, who often said the wrong thing and then instead of apologizing felt the need to do push-ups to show that he truly meant his apology, because doing 10 push-ups is apparently easier than a long drawn-out apology. But you need to understand, I cannot stress this enough. Misgendering someone by accident is not a situation that requires a long drawn-out apology. Please don't do that. You'll only make the person uncomfortable, not to mention make the whole thing about you instead of them. Not only does she say this absolutely nonsensical thing about Bharv that no one other than an extreme narcissist would do in real life, but then she goes on to explain to Rook and Balara that people can't just apologize because they don't really mean that they're sorry. Isabella says, sometimes people say oops, sorry, and hope that fixes it, but they just want to get the whole thing over with. Why, yes, when you make a small mistake, the point is to get the whole thing over with and move on. Why the hell would you want to make a big deal out of a tiny accident? If this happened to me in real life, if someone accidentally used the wrong pronoun when referring to me, and then they either started apologizing and saying, "Oh no, I'm so sorry, I'm the worst person ever, how could I make such a mistake, this is the worst thing I've ever done," or if they actually did 10 push-ups as an apology for misgendering me, I would be mortified. I would want the whole ground to swallow me up. I would want to cease existing just so that this utter embarrassment could stop. You know, most people get uncomfortable when people sing happy birthday to them and they have to just stand around and wait for the song to stop as everyone sings and stares at them. Do you really think that a trans person who clearly feels uncomfortable when they are reminded of their dead name or wrong pronouns, do you really think they would feel good when the person who misgenders them suddenly makes a big deal out of it and draws so much attention to the misgendering? Do you think a trans person wants this to be a huge topic that is discussed for a long time or made to be so important? I guarantee you, the moment you hear that wrong pronoun, you want to hide somewhere out of embarrassment or dysphoria. You do not want to be reminded for the next few minutes as the person makes a long drawn-out apology that you are trans, that your identity is something that people have to remember, that is not always what comes to them naturally to refer to you as. What Isabella does in this scene goes against everything that a normal trans person will tell you. I must ask, who the hell wrote this scene? 1. Please check that you are not transphobic, because this scene reads more like someone making fun of trans people being overly sensitive and thus requiring such huge apologies. 2. Please check that you do not have a narcissistic personality disorder, because Isabella just made this whole thing about herself to such an extent that I can't help but be concerned about the person who wrote her. 3. Even if you are progressive and aren't narcissistic, how could you possibly think this scene was acceptable to include? You know how people use the whole attack helicopter meme to insult trans people. You've literally just given them a new insult to hurl at us with a Bharv. I've already seen so many comments about pulling a Bharv. Why did you do this? Good representation of minorities in media is extremely important to humanize us and make people have more empathy towards us, to see us equally as people even if we have certain traits that we do not share with the majority. Instead, this kind of trans representation implies that if you want to interact with trans people, you have to walk on eggshells, and that any little mistake or misunderstanding is a huge problem that you should be crucified for. I can't understand how this was approved by actual cultural consultants, unless none of these consultants are trans people who actually have interactions with other people in real life, not just on the internet. With this type of representation, you are further othering trans people by showing that you must 100% accept what they say without having questions, or that you must prostrate yourself before them if you make the slightest mistake. Not only this, but by not allowing the player to disagree with Taash or at least question their aggressive behavior towards other people such as Shathann and Neve, you are implying that trans people can just be given a free pass whenever they act like assholes because you can't apparently criticize a person's behavior separately from other aspects of their identity. Trans people are not above criticisms if the way they act is rude or unacceptable. No person is above criticism, and implying this is only making people with anti-trans or more conservative sentiments have more negative opinions of us. I have one more thing to discuss as part of this critique, Taash's journal notes about being trans, which you can find as a codex entry and read through yourself. The codex entry is called Taash Notes, Meeting Shadow Dragons to Talk Gender Stuff. Let's get one thing out of the way first. I think it's weird and invasive to be able to read your companion's personal journals. I didn't like that you could do this in Inquisition with Sarah's notes. It feels uncomfortable and far too much like there is no such thing as personal boundaries between you and any of the companions, regardless of your relationship with them. I don't think that it implies a healthy friendship or relationship if you can't allow a person to have their own private thoughts that maybe they don't want to share with anyone else. Taash does mention at the beginning of these notes that they will maybe share these notes with Rook, but unless they literally hand you these notes themselves, I don't think it's nice to be snooping in their belongings. I will read this codex entry out for you, even if it pains me to do so. My apologies for reading these notes in caveman speak, but that's how they're written. Writing notes to work through gender crap, showing to Rook for help maybe. Mayveris pretty, Tarquin tough, both trans. Both open about being trans and said I could share stuff if it helped me on my journey. I did not ask for a journey. Trans means was other gender, then changed? Wait, no. Was always new thing, just now acknowledged. Not changing, affirming. Trans woman is woman. Not feeling right in body is dysphoria. Whole big thing. Could feel like want to be guy instead of girl. No. Could feel like not connected to body. Not everyone does this. Could feel uncomfortable with girls who act more feminine. No. I like girls. Girls smell good. But like hanging out with lords more than girls. ashamed of not doing what your gender should do. Ugh. Getting euphoria is feeling right. Non-binary means not man or woman. Can feel like either. Can look like guy/girl/neither. Some use she/he. Some swap. Some use they, but still single with name. Flynn is non-binary. They are coming this way. Confusing, but sure. Also gender fluid. Feel different on different days. Can't switch pronouns. Don't think that's me. Agender/bigender/demigender/others. Lot of different ones. Not me, but okay. Never too late. Valid even if no words when younger blah blah blah. Bioware saw notes and is mad. Write this down exactly. You're valid. People will say you're not enough this or too much that. Do not let it diminish you. No two journeys are alike. That's wonderful. Embrace it. Did you get all that? Okay, fine. First of all, why does Taash speak like a caveman or otherwise extremely unintelligent person? Who writes to themselves, Bioware is pretty, Tarkin tough, or girls smell good, other than, well, someone with serious issues? I would really like to know who exactly part of Bioware's writing team decided that a character who speaks like they're stupid and often says offensive things to people without anyone calling them out on being an asshole was the perfect character to be going through a journey of discovering their trans. As I've mentioned previously, trans people aren't above being criticized for their behavior just because they're trans, and most certainly pair an extremely dumb way of speaking with that, as well as forcing every player to agree with this character on pretty much everything, and you've guaranteed that this is one of the most hateable characters in the entire game. You've certainly guaranteed that people will be viewing trans people with less empathy for sure after being forced to interact with this absolute horrible mess of a character. And this is of course not even getting into the fact that the way this character speaks has no place within a fantasy setting, and more specifically the Dragon Age setting. Not even Sarah was this bad in Inquisition, and Sarah had plenty of issues with how she was portrayed and with how the Inquisitor could respond to her behavior. I also like how this codex entry emphasizes what I was mentioning earlier about transmasculine identities being shoved to the side. Tarquin is mentioned only once in the context of Bioware is pretty, Tarkin tough, both trans. That's it. Later on, Taash writes trans woman is woman, but not trans man is man. Caveman speak aside, isn't it weird that mentions of trans men or how trans men feel are very quickly brushed off, as if Taash shouldn't even be allowed to try to think about how they feel in relation to that? Especially considering how they mentioned in that conversation with Neve that when Shathann said Taash acts more like a man, that felt right. That to me certainly sounds more like how a transmasculine person feels, but what do I know? I'm just a trans guy. Clearly, the trans woman game director and non-binary lead writer would know a lot more about my identity, enough to pretty much ignore it outside of showing it as existing, doing the bare minimum. I don't know, this entire codex entry looks like someone who hates trans people looked at the Wikipedia article about trans identities and wrote it in the dumbest way possible to make fun of trans people. Like genuinely, I can't believe that this codex entry as well as all of Taash's scenes related to their identity made it into the game. Who actually approved this extremely reductive and poor quality representation? Like if anyone other than Bioware developed this game, I would assume that this is meant to be a joke at the expense of trans people. And even with knowing that Bioware developed it, I still feel like it's a cruel joke intended to make trans people look bad and to get more people to hate us. This is a message to the Bioware writers and other people who thought this was a good way to represent trans people. You are making conservative people hate us even more. You're even making people who were fine with trans people be less fine with us. You are giving them more ammunition to use against us, more reasons to say that trans and queer people shouldn't be involved in the creation of media. Is this what you wanted? I doubt it. Please learn from this mistake. I don't care that one person wanted to put their self-insert into a story and live out their own fantasies based on their personal trauma. You can do that in your own personal writing that no one else needs to see. Write a journal or a fanfic, go to therapy. When you are putting out a story that hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions, are going to interact with, you have to be more careful with how you represent subjects that are contentious in real life, subjects that have the power to affect how people are going to be treated based on how you represent them in your piece of media. You have to ensure that you are not being preachy, that you are not forcing people to agree with something just because it is the right thing to do. That is called propaganda, and it historically has never gone well for anybody. If you have stuck with me until the end of this analysis and critique, thank you. I am sure many people will disagree with me because everything has to be positive and pure and nothing can be problematic and so on and so forth. But I hope that at least a few people can understand where I as a trans person am coming from with my criticism of the trans representation in Veilguard. I didn't want to make this video longer than it already is, but if you're interested in knowing how I would personally approach writing a non-binary companion in Dragon Age, let me know and I'll make a video discussing that. I usually make guides or discussion videos about games, especially RPGs, so if you're looking forward to more videos about Dragon Age and other games I like, do remember to subscribe and leave a like and comment while you're at it too. They really help. A special thank you to my members who help keep this channel running. I'd really appreciate it if you'd consider joining the channel as a member to support me and unlock perks like early access to videos. This has been B-Tier Mutineer. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.